And although, as we're going to see tonight, that the progressive era does make great strides, statistically, almost that same number of people, 12.5% of the population, are in poverty today. So that's something to think about. So who's going to lead this reform? Well, we have a couple different groups of people. Right. On the very left-hand side, we have those who were at the forefront, the churches. The churches led the progressive movement, the progressive cause, through a variety of different angles. Some churches back then already had in place pretty well-formed charitable movements. At this time in history, most Americans did truly believe that charity came first from the church. And there are still people today that hold very strongly in that belief. So charity came first from the church. Two organizations that were founded during this time to bring the concept of charity by the church into the modern era were, of course, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, and then ultimately its sister organization, the Young Women's Christian Association, and the Salvation Army. Now, the Salvation Army today is still very well known as a charitable organization. The YMCA today, if I say that, many of you think of, a sports place, a place to go and use the gym and to use the pool and things like that and to take classes. But in most major cities, YMCAs not only were recreation centers, but they were also centers for people who were down on their luck to get a meal, short-term housing, and oftentimes a bit of the gospel. I remember growing up, the city where I grew up in, and I don't know if it's still true today, but the YMCA had like a housing section in it where people could stay. It was essentially a homeless shelter, but one with a different kind of structure than those that are non-denominational. And so the recreational aspect of the YMCA came about where you have these people that are down on their luck. They're looking for jobs. They need an outlet to blow off a little bit of steam. So they started off with putting basketball courts in. And then that eventually grew. And then to make money to support those who were down on their luck, they started then being able to, distribute memberships to others in this community who wanted to join to use the facilities. And then that money helped to sponsor their outreach with the poor. And so that's how the YMCA system initially got started. And as I said, still exists that way in some major cities. Locally, most of our YMCAs are simply rec organizations today. All of this hinged on what was known as the social gospel movement. And the social gospel movement basically felt that the poor did not deserve the fate that the social Darwinists, claimed they were recipients of. If you were a social Darwinist, you believed that, some people just were born with better luck than others or better lot in life. And if you were unlucky, enough to be poor, if you couldn't pull your way out of it, oh well. And the churches that supported the social gospel movement said, no, that's not how it should be. Everyone deserves a helping hand, and we're here to provide it to them. Similar to this movement, but from a more secular perspective, brings us to the woman in the middle, Jane Addams. Jane Addams founded the very first widespread settlement house movement in New York. It was known as the Hull House. The Hull House, Hull, was a place that was particularly open to young immigrant women or widowed immigrant women with children. And what the Hull House and then its duplicates did is they provided a place for these women to live that guaranteed safety for them, and then also guaranteed them the opportunity to gain critical skills that they would need to support themselves and their families, either in the present or in the future. They taught women to sew and then got them jobs in sewing factories. They taught them to cook. They taught them English. And so it was a place where women could get a helping hand and also get a foray into the workforce. So they connected women with jobs in their communities. And they were also very closely linked to that concept of the women's rights movement, which is really escalating at this time, as we'll see here in just a little while. And then our last photograph, you probably recognize, of course, is a photograph of Jacob Rees. I know some of you in particular honed in on this photo as one that particularly touched you. But Rees and his cohort, as I mentioned, they were known as muckrakers. And they are also going to be leaders in the progressive movement who help to make other individuals in society aware of what was going on. And while they themselves didn't necessarily know the answers on how to fix it, they hope to motivate other individuals into finding these solutions to these problems. So what we're going to do next is go through some of the specific features of progressivism. We're going to start with the progressives' focus on democracy. And during the progressive era, the individuals behind the progressive movement had some pretty specific ideas to increase the democracy in our society, and particularly to get more individuals access to being involved in our democratic system. And these are some of the ways, all of which still impact us today, that the progressives were able to be successful. The very first was the establishment of the direct primary system. The direct primary, which we all just lived through last year here in Virginia, is a system in which the voters, not the political party, the voters choose the candidates for public office. So it's a system by which the voters, not the candidates, choose the candidates for public office. So back in the old days, as they would say, it used to be that the parties would say, okay, you know, we're running Clay Graham on our ticket for president, and when the November election would roll around, the party would have his name listed. And you only had really two choices, or if there was a third party, you might have three. But if you were a Republican or a Democrat, your party only gave you one choice. And so those who were placed on the ballot were typically the elite of the party, and the regular people really didn't have a chance to participate. This changed with the implementation of the primary system. And so now today, every state either has a primary or a statewide party caucus, which is accessible to, at the very minimum, those who are registered voters within that party. Here in Virginia, we have what's known as an open primary, where as long as you are registered to vote, you can show up and vote in the primary, and you get to pick that day which party's primary you're going to participate in. The second way that the progressives expanded democracy was through the advent of the initiative. And the initiative is a way that the voter can propose legislation at a state level. So it is a means by which the voter can propose legislation at the state level. And then lastly, or not lastly, secondly, at the state level, we have the referendum. The referendum is the way that once legislation is proposed, either through an initiative or through the regular legislature, voters can weigh in on it. This past election last week, there were no referendums in Virginia, but I've seen several referendums since I've voted in the past here in the state of Virginia, as well as in Pennsylvania. Referendums have included topics like, I think the most recent one I remember was if the Virginia state government would exempt widows of individuals who were killed in the line of duty from having to pay their mortgages, and that one did pass. I've seen other ones, I can't remember if this is a Virginia one or a Pennsylvania one, that children who were victims of crimes could testify in courts on closed circuit cameras. instead of having to actually take the stand. That one might have been a Pennsylvania one. But referendums are when you have a particularly contentious piece of legislation, or, for example, the courthouse referendum that we had here last year in Augusta County, that was very controversial, and so they wanted to have direct public weigh-in. And then the last one for the state level is the recall, and this is where public officials at a state level can be removed from office by vote. Public officials at a state level can be removed from office by a vote. And basically what that means is if we think that Terry McAuliffe is doing a terrible job here in the last 2 months of his presidency, we could petition, or governorship, we could petition for removal of Terry McAuliffe from office, which would require X number of signatures. I don't know what that amount is in Virginia. And then if we get that number of signatures, a special recall election would be held, and you would go and you would say, should Terry McAuliffe be removed from office, yes or no? And then question 2 would be, if he is removed, who do you wish to take his place? And so these have happened throughout history. I do not know if in the state of Virginia we have ever had a recall election. The one that sticks out most in my mind is probably about 12 years ago. Governor Gray Davis in California was recalled in the midst of California's energy crisis, and the citizens of California voted yes, they wanted to recall him from his governorship. And then in question 2, they selected Arnold Schwarzenegger to replace him. And so that's how Arnold Schwarzenegger initially became the governor of California. I know in Illinois there was a recall election in 2009. So there have been several recall elections in the last 10 years. The next thing is at a federal level, but it does have an impact on the states as well. And this is the change of how U.S. senators were chosen. Under the Constitution, my previous AP government students, how were senators chosen? Clay, that includes you.
What?
How were senators chosen under the Constitution?
I got this right on.
Neil, do you remember?
Wasn't it board in high school?
You went to high school? Yeah. Anybody, this is open to anybody. I'm just picking on them.
State legislature.
Yeah, very good, Kira. Miss Steinspring would be proud. The state legislatures chose the senators that would represent the state at the federal level. Now, many people felt that this was not, direct vote of the citizens, and therefore did not directly reflect the voice of the people. And so it was with the 17th Amendment in 1913 that this was changed. So the 17th Amendment in 1913 establishes the direct election of U.S. senators, which is something that we will partake in next year. Also at this time, we see the implementation of the Australian ballot, named for its origination in Australia. And the Australian ballot is the ballot system by which we still use here in America today. The Australian ballot has 4 features. It is paid for at taxpayer expense. It lists all of the eligible candidates. It's available only at the polls, which includes absentee ballot. And most importantly, the big issue at this time is that it was secret. Because prior to the advent of the Australian ballot at the federal and state levels, most people knew who was voting for whom. Now, I had a little bit of like a mind blow last week. I don't know how many of you voted. You don't need to raise your hands, but I went and they handed me a piece of paper and I had to like draw it in circles. I'm like, what is this? This is 2017.
Don't want that.
But yeah, they're worried about hacking.
I saw that I walked in and I was like, okay. Because I voted on the electronic one for the presidential election.
Yeah, me too.
Step back in time.
Yeah, I'd never voted on a paper ballot in my life. So it was an experience. So make sure you get out and have that experience next year if they haven't
But the
gotten
printers can
electronic.
still be hacked.
I know. Yeah, it was a very weird thing, I thought. I don't know. And then lastly, the progressive era also brings forth changes in local government. And at this time, local governments were highly susceptible to corruption and mismanagement. And so they began to decide, kind of brainstorm how local governments could be better run. And out of Texas, what became known as the commission style form of local government originated. The best link I can give you with the commission style, though, is if any of you are fans of Gotham, the TV show Gotham, or the Batman comics, the whole like commissioner-based system, that is what we get out of commission-style local government, is you have individuals who are known as commissioners who are in charge of various aspects of a city's government and its day-to-day operations. And so it's a very divided system of government. New York today still runs with that system. The other system of government is known as the city manager style of government. And city manager style of government, if you did your reading in your textbook this week, you would have seen the name of Stanton, Virginia in your American Pageant textbooks, because the city manager style of government actually was born in Stanton. And it is the type of government that Stanton and many other cities throughout the United States still run with today. And that is where the city council officially hires a city manager. Our current city manager is Steve Owen, and he is in charge of the day-to-day running of the city of Stanton. So that's a little link to the history books and our local history. So any questions on democracy and the progressive era? All right, so next we're going to go into corralling big business. Big business, as we know from our discussion last week and our exploration of the concepts of robber barons and captains of industry, is certainly problematic at this time. And there are a lot of different issues with business, but at the core of it seems to be the fact that certain individuals, such as John Rockefeller, are taking over industries using perhaps less than ethical means and accumulating business organizations that become known as trusts. And so in 1890, the very first attempt to corral the trusts occurs with the creation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Sherman Antitrust Act is a step in the right direction, but it's not going to be until the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 that big business is really going to be brought to heel. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is the first attempt in 1890, and then in 1914 we have the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is really once and for all going to tackle the issue of trusts and will really lead to the busting of trusts. Also at this time, we have increasing issues with labor. And in 1902, the coal workers go on strike. And the coal workers were pretty upset with some, I guess, stalling tactics perhaps that the mine owners were taking in an attempt for them to negotiate new contracts. So they go on strike. Now, if the coal workers go on strike, what impact is this going to have?
Energy impacts.
Yeah, energy, lighting, like electric and things like that at this time, a lot of that stuff is fueled, a lot of industry is fueled by coal. And so if you don't have coal, other industries are going to shut down. The railroad industry, for example, would be heavily impacted. And so in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt actually steps in and arbitrates an end to the coal miners' strike. So Theodore Roosevelt in 1902 actually steps in. He is the first president to officially step in and arbitrate the end of a strike. Now, we know Cleveland got involved with the railroad strikes, but he himself didn't go in and negotiate. Roosevelt actually brings the parties together, sits them down at the table and says, okay, we've got to make a deal. And this was a very, very big step in some ways for the labor unions, because the president of the United States is officially giving them a seat at the table. And so that's going to be a turning point for union labor. And, in the eyes of the progressives, a turning point for the people who make up the labor unions. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Commission is created. Its initial purpose is to regulate railroads. As we previously discussed, the Interstate Commerce Commission is created to regulate railroads. And then throughout the Progressive Era, the Interstate Commerce Commission extends its reach into other areas of business and industry, ultimately turning into, during the Progressive Era, the Department of Commerce and Labor, which at that time was a combined department. And it also led to the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission regulates business practices at a more micro level. And the Federal Trade Commission also helped to oversee two very important pieces of legislation for those of you that like to eat food that were part of Roosevelt's Square Deal. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, and the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, Food and Drug Act in 1906 as well. And as I said, those were directly linked to Roosevelt reading The Jungle. So that's its role in big business. Next, we have the impact of the Progressive Era on social justice. As we can see here by this photograph, one of the most emblematic of Rees's photos, we have the very overcrowded conditions of a tenement in New York City that were certainly a symbol of many of the things that were wrong with the overcrowded conditions that existed in urban environments. The urban environments not only directly suffered from a lack of space, but they also suffered from a lack of sanitation. In most cases, this is in the area or in the era before flush toilets and plumbing. And so people were literally using chamber pots and dumping their waste out the windows. You can imagine what the alleyways of New York at that time must have looked like and smelled like. People joke about going back in time, but remember, if you went back in time back then, people didn't have deodorant, and the living conditions certainly stank. So you'd want to make sure you put some Vicks under your nose before you jumped into that time machine, because the streets of New York were not exactly glamorous. They really aren't today either, but back then it was pretty rank. And so Rees and other muckrakers, of course, highlighted these conditions, and fortunately it led to some reforms, including safer conditions in tenement houses with the requiring of fire escapes, and also eventually the addition of better sanitation systems. The medical industry, of course, also recognized that this was very, very bad for the people living there, and ultimately led to better conditions and regulations as well on how many people could be housed in apartments, etc. Along with these urban issues, of course, went hand in hand the topic of child labor that was highlighted in the piece by John Spargo that you read at the beginning of class. Many of these immigrants that lived in these tenement houses were poorer than poor, and they required on the labor of their children, some of whom would go to work as early as 4 years old and work 12-hour days. And as we discussed previously, if you're working at that age, you are not going to school, you are not getting sunlight, you are not getting proper nutrition. So in 1904, the National Child Labor Committee forms. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee forms. And by 1914, most states have begun to implement child labor laws. So most of the states by 1914 begin to regulate how old you have to be to enter the workforce. If you are a child under 16 working, how many hours you are limited to, and so on and so forth. Better working conditions for children also led to better working conditions for adults. And of course, much of this was led by the labor union movement. This time period was kind of a back and forth between labor unions and business owners. During this era, labor unions made gains, and then unfortunately at times the courts would, say, well, no, what you're asking for, the business owners aren't required to give you. And then sometimes the courts would say, yes, what you're asking for, the businesses must give you. So it was a very slow back and forth to gain ground during this era. Right.
One thing that the book didn't mention at all was that the worst part of a child is the psychological problems.
Oh, yeah.
That would ensue. I feel like at 4 years old, working 12 hours a day would definitely cause psychopathic tendencies.
Yeah.
Like that's a given.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my most favorite fiction books, which they're actually making into a miniseries on TBS this January, it's called The Alienist. If you guys are interested in the progressive era and you like historical fiction, it's written by Caleb Carr. It focuses on like child criminals, and part of that I'm sure is driven by, if you're 4 years old and like your entire life is working 12 hours a day in a factory, that is not going to be good for your mental state. So
I mean, think about some like the world's worst serial killers had it like easier than that, and they turned out to be
serial killers. Yeah, and we're gonna see, like the crime rate during this time is definitely problematic, and I'm sure very closely linked to some of those issues of lack of education and poor conditions that children were brought up in. Very difficult. And also within the working conditions during this era, it's important for us to mention the role that the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire played. I'm sure some of you are familiar. If you have not yet done the reading in the textbook, you may still be familiar with this. It occurred May 25th, 1911. And basically what ended up happening was that in this factory that literally made shirtwaists, it was predominantly women who were working in the sewing industry. And there was problems with theft. So the business owners locked a lot of the doors to fire escapes and also even to stairwells, requiring women to use the elevators and be checked very carefully at the end of their shifts. And it's believed that somebody knocked over a lantern into a bin of scraps, or like threw a cigarette into a bin of scraps, and it started a massive fire. And they couldn't get out to the fire escapes. There were a limited number of fire escapes, and some of the fire escapes weren't even carefully anchored to the sides of the building. And most of the women were either forced into elevators or down into very narrow stairwells. And there wasn't a very clear plan for people to get out of the building. 146 people died, mainly women. And after the fire occurred, they actually lined the bodies up in the street, and journalists took photographs of it because they just were trying to clean up the situation. And that's what they did. And it led to a cry for better working conditions in New York City, as well as improved fire safety. And it was a very, very horrific tragedy, but fortunately some of the very things that caused it were ultimately corrected as a result of that very tragic event. And the last things in this category as far as social justice, these kind of really all tie together. The people who were having their children work, the women that were killed in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, most of these individuals were immigrants. And coming to this country for, in order to, quote, achieve the American dream was, something that many of them sought to do, but were often very ill-equipped to do. And many of them worked very, very hard in attempts to assimilate into American society, but they had needs of assistance to learn English. They were also being exploited by factory owners, as well as individuals who were landlords. And so it showed us as an American people, that these groups of people coming into our country could be very good for the American system, but they had very significant needs as well that needed to be met. And tying all of this together is our next topic, which is prohibition. Because oftentimes individuals that were in these working classes that were working night and day to, I skipped a slide, that were working night and day to feed their families were often those who were most susceptible to, as they called it back then, the drink. So prohibition was a movement to eliminate the use and consumption of alcohol in society. and ultimately would lead to the only amendment to the Constitution that was ever repealed, and that was the 18th Amendment. The driving forces behind the Prohibition movement were the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and then ultimately the Prohibition Party, which was is today still the longest lasting third party in American history. It was founded in 1869 and still exists today. They still call for the prohibition of alcohol, but today they also call for the prohibition of marijuana, as well as several other very conservative beliefs, like they're anti-abortion, and then also like anti-video games and other things that they believe are causing the ills of society. They were also joined in their efforts by the Anti-Saloon League, and this coalesced in the Jubilee Convention at which the 18th Amendment was proposed. And the 18th Amendment is the only amendment to the Constitution that came about as a result of a convention at the national level. Brayden.
What caused this movement?
This is a great question. So the movement was caused because these individuals, predominantly women, felt that alcohol was tempting individuals to do things that were bad for their families. So largely immigrant men were spending their paychecks on alcohol instead of taking them home to their families, or they were drinking and beating their wives, or they were drinking and leaving their families, or they were drinking and falling off of piers. And they basically saw alcohol as the cause of all of the ills of society. And I always love this picture. I mean, I'm sure Clay right here in the front row, I mean, he's having a really hard time not imagining kissing one of those women there. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. I mean, I'm sure that men were beating down their doors, giving up alcohol
You
for
would
them.
probably have to be drunk to kiss them.
That picture always cracks me up when I think of this era. All right, and so that is the Prohibition movement. All right, the last movement that I want to touch upon is the movement of environmental conservation. The Progressive Era is really the birthplace of the modern conservation movement. And as we have officially closed the frontier, as we discussed last week, we now are thinking of ways that we can conserve what's left of some of the big lands that exist in the West. And really, as it is often today, although it's certainly a mixed bag today, the conservation movement during this time period was often led by individuals who were wealthy and also who were very into like outdoor pursuits such as hunting. Excuse me. And at the height of this movement was Theodore Roosevelt. Although interestingly enough, it would be his successor, William Howard Taft, who would conserve the most public lands. It would be Roosevelt who would kick off the land conservation movement. And the land conservation movement under Theodore Roosevelt, who succeeded William McKinley in the presidency when McKinley was shot in September of 1901, as I mentioned last week, Roosevelt creates the kind of this new wave of land preservation and the creation of the national park. Of course, it's going to be under Woodrow Wilson that the National Park Service is officially created, but its roots are found under Theodore Roosevelt. And it's also going to be this issue of national parks and land conservation that will lead to a very pivotal election in 1912. And the roots of that particular election come in 1898 when Roosevelt's predecessor, William McKinley, appoints a gentleman by the name of Gifford Pinochet, P-I-N-O-C-H-E-T. Well, it's spelled for you up here as well. Appoints a man by the name of Gifford Pinochet to a leadership position within the Department of the Interior, overseeing the Division of Forestry. And when Roosevelt comes into office, he keeps Pinochet in that role under a gentleman by the name of Ballinger. And Ballinger Pinochet discovers is exploiting national park lands and selling off some of the land to the highest bidder, who happen to be his cronies. And Pinochet exposes this issue under the Taft administration. Once Roosevelt has left office, Taft keeps them both on board. And he exposes this, and Taft refuses to act on it. And Roosevelt is so incensed that Taft has refused to act on this that he comes out of retirement and wants to run in the 1912 presidential election. So many of you are familiar already with the fact that Roosevelt, resurfaces in 1912 as one of the 4 candidates for president that ran with a pretty decent showing at the national level. And it is directly because of land conservation that we see Roosevelt reappear. Bless you. So the election of 1912, should have been a pretty easy election for the Republican Party. William Howard Taft had had a reasonably successful 4 years in the Oval Office, despite being the only US president to get stuck in a White House bathtub. Taft was a man of substantial girth, and bathtubs at that time just weren't made to hold him. And so he actually got stuck in the bathtub, and they had to butter him up and pull him out. And so after that, White House bathtubs did grow in size. But as I mentioned, during the Taft administration, the Ballinger-Pinochet affair, as it was known, occurs. And Theodore Roosevelt is so incensed by this event that he tells Taft that he should not run for re-election, and that he tells the remainder of the Republican Party that they should instead run him, that he is going to come out of retirement, and he's going to save the Republican name from this scandal, this terrible scandal that has occurred. And the Republicans basically take one look at Teddy and go, nope, you retired in 1908. Taft's done a decent job. We're going to run him again. Meanwhile, the Democrats, on their 36th ballot at their, 46th ballot at their national convention, finally settle on a presidential candidate who at that time is the head of Princeton former head of Princeton University, governor of New Jersey, a man by the name of Woodrow Wilson. I think some of you might have heard of him. And so Woodrow Wilson, on the 46th ballot, is chosen to be the Democratic candidate for president. Now, if it takes you 46 ballots to become a presidential candidate, the chances of you actually winning are probably pretty slim. But enter into the equation, of course, these two chuckleheads on the left, and then also on the right, a socialist candidate that you've also heard of, a man by the name of Eugene Debs, who has actually been in prison several times for leading socialist labor movements, including the Pullman strike. And then we also have 2 minor candidates who are running on the prohibition and socialist labor tickets, but they're really not going to impact the election. The tricky thing about this particular election is that all 4 of these men are claiming that they are going to revolutionize America. And you've got, Roosevelt, who ultimately doesn't win, on the Progressive Political Party ticket. He called it the Progressive Bull Moose ticket because he was actually shot at while giving a campaign speech, and the bullet was deflected by the wadded up speech in his pocket. And he set out, he was, fit as a bull moose. You couldn't kill him, and he proceeded to deliver the speech. And then you've got Taft, who's, claiming that he's done all of this for public lands, and, he's busted all these trusts, and he's going to continue to take America by the storm. You have Woodrow Wilson, who's the first Southerner to be on a national party ticket in a number of years. And then, of course, you have the revolutionary socialist candidate. And so when you bring all of it together, you get these election results. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson does win the election. He captures 41%, what we call a plurality of the popular vote. and 435 electoral votes, with the highest ever turnout of a third party. You have Theodore Roosevelt, who plays the spoiler for his pal, William Howard Taft, who only garners 23% of the vote. Now, again, I don't teach math for a reason, but Clay, 23 plus 27 equals
50 something.
50. Assuming you're not going to be a math teacher, right?
No, but I gotta take a look.
Okay. Assuming that all of the votes that went to Roosevelt had gone to Taft or vice versa, would Wilson have been president?
Nope.
Would you all have had to visit the Woodrow Wilson birthplace as children?
Probably.
Probably not. Okay. And so Roosevelt plays a spoiler role for Taft and effectively costs the Republicans the election and leads to Woodrow Wilson becoming the first Southerner in a number of years to sit in the White House. And so Wilson's campaign ran on the concept of a new freedom. That was what he, purported. Theodore Roosevelt was the square deal. He's going to be the new freedom. And then, of course, eventually we'll get Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal and a host of other slogans that I'll give you as we progress through history. But one of the very first things that Wilson does after taking office in March of 1913 in instituting his new freedom is he takes on the issue of the tariff. He calls Congress into special session and says that in order to further galvanize American industry, but also have a healthy trading relationship with the rest of the world, we need to lower the tariff. We need to lower the tariff, the tax placed on imported goods. It needs to be lowered. And the American public, of course, is going, well, then how are we going to make money for the American people? And Wilson says, well, we're going to tax their income. And he helps to push through Congress and then ultimately ratification by the states, the 16th Amendment, which creates a system of graduated income tax, which all of us lovingly adore today. Then, to further manage the country's financial affairs, he creates, or again, pushes through Congress, the Federal Reserve Act, which establishes 12 regional banks that'll handle the government's money, as well as help to oversee the money of the American people, instead of private banks that were destabilized and inefficient. He also helps to create the Federal Trade Commission, which will further oversee acts of trade and commerce. Helps to grease the wheels for the Clayton Antitrust Act, which we previously discussed. Tells states that labor legislation is really their issue. And then ultimately also comes around to help the farmers, which is something that he was not initially in favor of. Unfortunately for women, his new freedom doesn't really address their needs. And it's not going to be until the post-World War I era, in the very last year of Wilson's presidency, that he will help to promote the passage of what will be the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Prior to World War I, Wilson was not particularly in favor of giving women the right to vote. He saw it as an unnecessary burden on women in a society. In fact, many women themselves saw voting as an unnecessary burden and saw that it's something that they should not have to do. But finally, in 1920, fortunately, at least by my point of view, women gained the right to vote. So the lasting effects of the progressive era are this. Politics is reform for now. Unfortunately, many of these reforms will have loopholes in them that individuals and corporations will exploit until present day. Labor practices are changed. Many of these changes, fortunately, are more lasting. It's going to be during this era that we first see the creation of a 10-hour workday and then ultimately an 8-hour workday, as well as a rise in wages. Trusts are busted, mainly in part due to Taft and then Wilson. Cities begin to provide better services, including improved transportation and sanitation. Women gain the right to vote, but unfortunately during this era, African Americans are still largely disenfranchised. Even though they legally have the right to vote, some of the things that you looked at the past 2 weeks showed you exactly why they were unable to exercise it. So, any questions on the progressive era before we get into World War I? All right, let's take about an 8-minute break, and we'll come back then and finish the night with America and the Great War.
I thought it was interesting. Studying Immigration 2017 quarters got Ellis Allen on the back of it.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Huh, that's funny.
I don't know if it's on.
Just New Jersey, because it says New Jersey. I wonder if they're doing new ones for the states. Remember how they did that a couple years ago?
Possibly.
That's your homework, though. Look at all the quarters that you got. See if it's on other ones.
So we're halfway through that. What is our exam?
What's up?
Is our exam going to be Monday?
Yeah. I'll get you specific details as to when and where. But I mean, it'll be like Monday this time.
They're all pretty good. Yeah, they are. But my dad was.
I love how my phone creepily knows that I am at Woodridge Community College.
Facebook, hey, you're here. You want to tell other people? No, I want to tell other people.
Yeah,
You want to know they know where I'm at, they can come find me.
exactly.
You doing good in your fantasy with
Yes, I won both my games this week, but I'm like 4 and 6 in my win leagues, and I forget. I'm like, I'd be like 7 and 3 in my other, or 6 and 4. I'm doing better than that one. So Brady was good this weekend. Okay, anybody still out? Am I missing anybody? Oh, Matt. Okay. Wait a minute or two. I'm glad I'm not flying anymore. I was on 26 flights. Just a few changes.
I like flying if it's, once it becomes bad, it gets bad, but I don't know how to take it.
Yeah, I'm just not a person of the process.
Overseas flights, because you can't sleep, so you're up for 8 hours, like, what do I do? I watch 4 movies.
I'm doctor at like doing this, I'm just like taking my call.
I don't know what you gotta do. When I went over to Europe, oh my gosh, we left at 6 p.m. here. When we got there, it was like 10 a.m. I didn't sleep any bit on the flight, and we couldn't get into our hotel until 3 o'clock. So I pretty much stayed up 24 hours.
Did you go with school?
With FFA.
Really? Where'd you go?
We went on to London, saw an urban agriculture farm there, flew to Rome. Toured Rome for a day, then took the train up to Madonna, whatever, and Bologna, Italy.
Okay.
Saw cheese production, balsamic vinegar production. Then we took the train and went up through the Alps into Germany, stayed on the Germany-Austria line for a night. Went to Austria that day, and we took the train to Munich, and we saw the Fendt factory there, and we went to a concentration camp.
Outside of Munich.
So,
Dachau. Interesting. That's pretty cool that you get to go.
then we flew back.
Did you see Miss Fields won Dobbermore? I was pretty excited about that. Me too. Email her my congratulations. I go last year, actually, I was reviewing for the 121 final, and I got my call that I won mine. And I came back in, and he says, everything okay? And I'm like, yeah, I just won a daughter. All right, so we'll go ahead and get restarted here and finish out our night talking about the Great War. Might get out of here a little early. All right, so the Great War, as it was known, comes during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. But of course, in order to do that justice, we need to talk a little bit about the environment in which the Great War comes about. When Woodrow Wilson comes into office, he outwardly tells everybody that he is a very idealistic individual. And he says that, he believes that he is a man who, with his administration, can create a new world order based on morality and idealism. He thinks that he truly believes that he can have a positive impact on societies of the world through his actions of diplomacy. One of the first steps that he takes to achieve this is he names William Jennings Bryan, who we know, of course, as the chief attorney in the Scopes Monkey trial, as well as the opposing candidate in the election of 1896 that promised that he would not crucify America on a cross of gold as a presidential candidate. He was known for his cross of gold speech. And so he names William Jennings Bryan to be his Secretary of State. And William Jennings Bryan is a very religious man, and he feels that it is his religious duty to advance democracy. And of course, Wilson, who grows up, of course, the son of a minister in the South during the era of the Civil War, hates war and also believes that democracy is the way to go. And so one of the very first major policy changes from the two previous, or I should say 3 previous Republican administrations that the Wilson administration takes is the advent of what they call cooling off treaties. They vow that in areas of the world where conflict exists, they will step in and ask participating nations to pledge not to go to war, to enter into a cooling off period, and hopefully, ensure that, war cannot occur because both nations will take a step back and take a deep breath. How well do you think that's going to work? Yeah, not going to work very well. Most nations are like, thanks, but no thanks. Unfortunately, Wilson himself is unable to really implement that policy from an American perspective because he is challenged very early on in his presidency with issues in Latin America. The first of the issues that we're going to talk about is in Mexico. Prior to Wilson's entrance into the Oval Office, there were issues already brewing in Mexico. There was a military dictator. The details, by the way, of this are not something that you need to have memorized. There was a military dictator by the name of Diaz who was dominating Mexico. And then in 1910, the Mexican people overthrow Diaz. So again, this is prior to Wilson coming into office. The next individual who takes power is a gentleman by the name of General Huerta, who installs himself as a new military dictator in Mexico. And enter into the scene Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is not a fan of Huerta because he believes that government should result from the assent of the governed, a very principal ideal in American democracy. And he refuses to recognize the new Mexican government. Diplomatically, he will not recognize the Mexican government because he doesn't like Huerta and Huerta's methods of controlling the people. And so he initially places an arms embargo on the Mexicans, and then he lifts it to kind of fund Mexican revolutionaries. Not that America would ever, fund revolutionaries in any country. Things really begin to hit the fan when a group of American sailors who are on liberty in Mexico end up in a restricted area and get arrested. And so Wilson negotiates with the Huertan government says that, these sailors simply made a mistake. The Huertan government apologizes and releases the sailors, but on their way out the door, the individual who was overseeing the sailors made them salute the American flag. And this, just absolutely insults Wilson, insults the sailors. And so tensions begin to escalate, and Wilson actually authorizes American forces to occupy areas of Veracruz where the incident occurred. Huerta, of course, is not happy to have American sailors occupying Mexico, American soldiers occupying Mexico. Continuing back and forth by both sides ultimately leads to a treaty being brokered by what they call the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, to get peace in this situation. And so ultimately, Huerta is forced to leave office, but America pulls its troops out of Mexico. That should have been the end of the story. Unfortunately, with the absence of a dictator in Mexico, a revolution occurs, and the revolution spills over the border. Many of the revolutionaries on one side hoped that America would get re-involved. And so how do you get America re-involved? You kill American citizens. So a group of individuals led by a gentleman by the name of Pancho Villa, who was featured in the middle of that photograph, killed a train full of Americans just over the American border. And they also conducted other raids along border towns in Texas and New Mexico, hoping that Woodrow Wilson would then get re-involved in the situation in Mexico, because it's obviously having an impact on the United States. He ultimately sends in General John Pershing, who many of you may know from World War I war, who attempts to chase Pancho Villa, and after many repeated attempts fails. And then ultimately, the government in Mexico restabilizes without much assistance from the United States, and thankfully conflict there is averted. But it is with this conflict that Wilson begins to recognize that his own policy of cooling off treaties is not going to be very effective, because he himself cannot employ it when American lives are at stake. And so he has to get involved in the Mexican Civil War in an attempt to save American lives. He also is having issues in the Caribbean, many of which were started by his predecessor in Caribbean nations such as Haiti. The Taft administration practiced a policy known as dollar diplomacy. And basically what dollar diplomacy said was, it was the belief that if Americans had investments in Caribbean nations, that they would then also be concerned about the political stability of those nations. And it's like, if I lend Clay $100, I'm going to care about Clay's ability to pay me back and how stable Clay is in his economic situation. Whereas if Clay and I don't have any type of relationship, I might be like, oh, that sucks, but not really care about it. But if I have money invested, I'm going to care more. And so Taft, during his administration, convinced many American businessmen to invest in companies and farms and things like that in the Caribbean, so that he would then have a level of manipulation to intervene in those nations politically. So it was a new form of imperialism, basically, is what dollar diplomacy was. And so Wilson ultimately is forced to go back on his desire to stay out of the Caribbean nations when several different political regimes destabilize and he has to send in American troops. Again, he doesn't want to get involved, but when he is being pressured by American business owners who have investments in this area, he ultimately has to send troops into Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. And his repeated use of military force during this era in Haiti, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic only continue to fuel the fires of hatred of Latin American nations towards the United States at this time. But all of this, of course, will be eclipsed in 1914 when the world becomes embroiled in the First World War. And so let's take a look at the causes of it now. After our commercial break.
Number 4, Kansas. 2017 Mitsubishi Outlander, one of America's safest crossovers, well equipped for under $24,000.
The rise of nationalism is key to understanding how World War I comes back.
The people of all the countries fighting rose up to defend the country that they loved. And because of that, they were willing to accept slaughter on a scale unparalleled. This is a war between nations, and the national governments have to make an argument to their people about why they should sacrifice their lives, their time, their money for the war effort.
It also is a culmination of their own fears about colonialization, about this process where you have diverse people being brought into empires that really don't share their same cultural ideas, their same cultural identity. It's the problem of nationalism. It's the problem of nationalism expressed violently in this terrible war that cost Europe almost a generation.
Perfect illustration, Eastern Europe. Look at Serbia. Serbians are saying, we don't want to be ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's an old, tired, imperialistic structure. We are our own country. It's the Serbians who assassinate Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, and of course, that's the trigger that begins the whole conflict.
The outbreak of the war intensifies national feelings. It also makes nationalism the language both of war and of the post-war settlement.
And more than that, it made the people who had fought the war feel like they had earned something.
So if you go to Versailles, if you go to the treaty negotiations, you can see them discussing the rights of small nations, the rights of national self-determination. Those are words that Wilson uses. And he wanted nations to be independent, discrete things.
He saw a world that would never again go to war. A world where squabbles between nations could be settled diplomatically, where they could not have to be settled militarily. This was to him a war to end all wars. And I sincerely believe Wilson realized before he passed away that World War I had been for nothing.
So we'll be exploring some of that tonight and into next week. But World War I certainly had many causes, and within those causes, ultimately some dominoes that would lead to World War II. But at its roots, one of the driving causes of the war was a need for social change. European society at this time was highly stratified, and those who were in the lower classes, particularly as we saw, the Black Hand Gang, which led the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and other individuals within European monarchical societies, see a need for change. And Friedrich Nietzsche and other philosophers of this time wrote extensively on how social change oftentimes leads to upheaval of stratification during warfare. And so the lower classes were motivated by this as one of their reasons behind going to war. At the core of the conflict, of course, is the concept of nationalism, which really is a powder keg that is waiting for a match to ignite it. And that match will ultimately be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 26, 1914. And that will be really the spark that is going to kick off the war. The Bosnian people, Serbian people are sick and tired of being lorded over by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this group of assassins who call themselves the Black Hand Gang, who were very poverty-stricken, consumptive young men who hailed from these provinces, orchestrate the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on that day. And that very closely ties with the next concept of alliances. There is online, you can find a site that talks about if World War I were a bar fight. And in reality, the matter is it's kind of partially true. It kind of escalates like a bar fight. The alliance system was created at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And basically what the alliance system did is it created a balance of power. It basically stacked the European countries on two sides in a way that was equal, that was supposed to prevent them from wanting to go to war. Because you don't go into a fight if you know it's going to be a draw. Because what's the point of fighting unless you have some really pent-up aggression and really just want to go Mike Tyson on someone? The reality is you fight to win. And so if you know going into a fight that there's no way you can win because both sides are equal, it's going to diminish your chances of fighting. And it's fairly successful throughout much of the 19th century. Most of the fighting that occurs in Europe during the latter part of the 19th century is self-contained, just two countries themselves. And so what ends up happening is, in the aftermath of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary, who has just had their Archduke assassinated, declares war on Serbia. Now, Austria-Hungary is a fairly medium to large-sized country at this time, and Serbia is tiny. And so to back up Serbia, Russia, which has a medium-ish to large-sized-ish army, gets involved. And so at this point in time, we've got a pretty fair fight. We've got Clay fighting Doug, okay? And so, pretty fair fight. But what ends up happening is Brighton gets upset that Doug has just jumped in to help Amy, because Amy is going to be Serbia. And, Brighton gets upset. So Brighton, who's Germany, has Clay's back. Well, now we've got two, decent-sized guys taking on a decent-sized guy and a tiny country over here. And so it's not necessarily going to be a fair fight. I don't know. Amy might be a black belt in karate. I don't want to judge a book by its cover. So she might be able to take on Brighton pretty well. But, if we were having a cage match, you guys might bet on these two over here first. And so Germany upsets this balance of power by getting involved. And when Germany gets involved, essentially all hell breaks loose, because Germany, in getting involved, is now up against France and Russia and Serbia. And France, who is, the ally of Russia here, Neil, he gets involved now. Well, Brighton wants to attack Neil. The only way that Brighton can attack Neil is if he goes through Kira, who's Belgium. And so Brighton goes through Belgium to get to Neil. Well, now the Belgians are involved. And Diana, who's England, is upset that Brighton just went through her friend Kira. And so now Diana gets involved. And before you know it, all the countries of Europe are involved in a conflict that really initially just started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia with a little assistance from Russia. Had it just been, these two versus Clay, it would have probably gone to a draw. But when you get the involvement of Brighton, who just can't help but want to, stick up for his pal Clay, that's what throws off the balance of power. And that is why, as we're going to see, much of the blame of the war is going to come upon Germany, not, because of, any particular start of Germany in the actual causes of the war, but because of their involvement, which is going to escalate it. And so, by the end of the summer of 1914, this is what the map of Europe is really looking like. You have your Allied powers, who were known as the Triple Entente, and then you have your Central powers, who were also known as the Triple Alliance. And what's up?
And then there's Switzerland.
Yes,
Always
and then
neutral.
there's Switzerland, always neutral. And so as the war is going to progress, it's going to also bring in additional individuals. Japan is actually very eager to seize Germany's holdings in the Pacific. So Japan jumps in the war against Germany. The Ottoman Turkish Empire wants to join their pals, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because they want to restore the empires of Europe and Central Asia. So they get involved, and it's just a mess. Really, by August of 1914, it is a mess. But still, the soldiers that are fighting mistakenly believe that they are going to be home by Christmas. Both sides think they've got it locked. And what they don't know is that this is going to be a war unlike any other. World War I is going to eclipse every previous conflict that has ever occurred in the world in both scope and carnage. It is going to eclipse every other war that has ever happened in the world in both scope and carnage. It's going to be the first war to feature machine guns, aerial bombings, poison gas, flamethrowers, landmines, and long-range artillery. It's going to be the first war to feature machine guns, aerial bombings, poison gas, flamethrowers, landmines, long-range artillery. The state of battlefields will be horrid. There'll be armored tanks, which are a new invention of this time period. There's going to be trench warfare, which is really going to characterize the war. Basically, what each side would do is they would go into an area, they would dig trenches that were miles long. The other side would dig a trench on the other side of the field, and then they'd hide out in the trenches, and then they'd try to jump up and sneak into the other side's trench to overtake it. But most of the time, they'd meet in the middle in no man's land. They'd fight to a draw, and they'd both retreat back to their trenches with lots of dead left in the middle. The trenches were filled with water. And when you're sitting in water and you're sitting in muck, there's bacteria, there's rats. You're getting fungal diseases. The rats are nibbling on your ears. The food that you're eating becomes infected and you quickly get diseases. So it is a time of just absolute desperation for these soldiers. It is miserable to live in the trenches, yet 475 miles of them spanned the European countryside during World War I. There were high casualties on both sides. At the end of the war, 9 million had been killed and 19 million had been wounded. At the end of the war, 9 million had been killed and 19 million had been wounded. Only 250,000 of those dead were Americans, because America does not want to get involved very quickly. This is something else that you will explore this week. Casualties were soaring on the European front, and both sides were pressuring America to get involved on their behalf. Americans found it very difficult to be neutral due to the large presence of what we call hyphenated Americans, German Americans, French Americans, English Americans, you get the drift. Both sides, wanted the Americans to benefit them, but ultimately it is going to be the triple entente, the so-called allied powers, who are going to win us over, because allied demands for both food and war supplies generate an economic boom in this country. And despite our attempts to cling to neutrality, it's ultimately going to be the violation of freedom of the seas that's going to catapult us into the war. One of the things that we proposed under Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan was to have both sides accept what was called the Declaration of London, which would promise free passage to trade ships in the Atlantic. The Germans, by this point in time, have undertaken a policy of submarine warfare, and they are threatening to bomb any ships that they feel are en route to provide supplies to the other side, despite the fact that we say we'll bring supplies to them as well if they pay for them. Unfortunately, the Germans, who were initially willing to accept the declaration, then back away from it when the British won't sign on. And Americans are faced with, a decision to get involved or to not get involved. And so pressuring them to get involved is much propaganda from the British side. We see these particular propaganda posters, which are, targeting citizens. We have, the claim that the Neutrality Act is really being blown away by aid that will help to win the war. And although this particular piece of propaganda on the right initially targets British citizens to get involved, it's manipulated to also claim that Americans need to help with the effort as well. And so as our deep involvement in trade with the Allies continues, we also begin to recognize that German domination of Europe would ultimately be a threat to American security. And then finally, it is going to be submarine warfare that is really going to drive the nail in the German coffin, and that is with the sinking of the Lusitania. And some of you are familiar, of course, with the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger liner that was sunk by a German submarine. Now, I say passenger liner loosely because in its cargo hold, it did contain Allied war supplies. And so the Germans did exactly what they said they would do, which was to sink any ship that they perceived to be carrying war supplies to the Allies. Germans did not care that it was also containing passengers who were destined to for Europe. And ultimately, this is going to really be the major piece in the public relations push for Americans to declare war against the Germans. The Germans also intercept a message that will become known as the Zimmermann telegram, which basically claims that the German Foreign Minister, German Foreign Secretary Zimmermann is looking to get Mexico involved in World War I by having the Mexicans attack the United States. And they're promising that if the Mexicans attack the United States, that they'll help them beat us and get back their land in the American Southwest. And so this, along with the Lusitania, infuriates the public. In early 1917, additional American vessels are sank in the Atlantic by German submarines. And so in April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson officially declares that the world must be made safe for democracy. The world must be made safe for democracy. And thus, we embark on our involvement in April of 1917 in World War I. Now, our initial approach in 1917 is the approach of a country that is not prepared to go to war, okay? We, at this point in time, had been promoting an isolationist perspective. And so the very first thing that we do is make contributions through our Navy. We volunteer to set up a blockade and lay a gigantic minefield across the North Sea, which prevents German U-boats from coming out of the North Sea into the Atlantic. We also start to create a specific war fund with the Liberty Loan Act, which Congress basically agrees to add $5 billion to the national debt in Liberty bonds, $3 billion of which could instantly be lent to the Allies, and the other $2 billion of which would go to building up American forces. And so what a war bond was, is you purchased this bond of, say, $5, which is basically like loaning the American government $5. And in exchange for purchasing it, you agree that when the war is over, you can cash it back in and get $7. So it's giving the American government a temporary infusion of money, but then it's going to cost them later when they have to pay these loans back. And so they organized Liberty Bond drives. They enlisted individuals who were known as Minutemen, who would go around the country and give these minute-long pump-up speeches, or up to some of them were 4-minute men. They gave longer speeches that they would, get these people to buy Liberty bonds and fund the war effort. It was a way you could get involved even if you couldn't fight. And they also created the Selective Service Act of 1917, which is otherwise known as the draft. Yes, and so all of you that are 18 and male in here have hopefully registered for the Selective Service. Back then, it was all men who were aged 21 to 30. Today, it's 18 to 35. And you had to register in the event of a draft. This was to mobilize and ready troops for eventual service abroad. And of course, all of this was also driven by large pieces of propaganda, which you'll see at home this week, as well as here with our lovely Beat Back the Hun advertisement. So in addition to readying military forces, we also had to change over our manufacturing and home front capabilities. Wilson created the War Industries Board and tasked the War Industries Board to transfer industrial manufacturing from consumer items to war-related products. They also had to determine how they could overcome a shortage of labor because his men were eventually going to be sent off to fight the war in Europe, and immigration was closed off due to issues with foreign powers during wartime. They had to determine who was going to make these goods that were going to fuel our fight in the war. And of course, they turned to whom? Women, yes. In record numbers, women would take to the workforce, as well as additional individuals in minority groups like African Americans and Mexican Americans, who were often not as desirable to be conscripted into the armed forces because of segregated units. Many northern businesses even sent recruiting agents into the deep south to finally lure individuals who were of the next generation of formerly enslaved individuals to come and work in the north. This is going to ultimately lead to a period in the United States known as the Great Migration, where African Americans from the South will migrate north to work in northern industries. Unfortunately, this is going to lead to increased racial tensions in the North in the post-war period, as these African Americans do not return to the South and instead stay in manufacturing jobs. And so that's going to lead to some conflict, as we're going to see. But the real winner here are the women. The women are going to fulfill labor needs. They're going to organize war bonds and relief drives. They're going to support the Red Cross. Some are even going to join the Army Nurse Corps. And ultimately, even though many of them will return to the domestic realm after the war, their contributions are not going to go unrecognized, and it's going to be their contributions that will ultimately lead to the establishment of the right to vote. Behind this home front push was American propaganda, and we see some pieces of it here. The one on my right, your right, get behind the girl he left behind him, join the land army, support the women working in agriculture. On the left, be patriotic, sign your country's pledge to save the food. Rationing was a big thing. Herbert Hoover was actually head of the rationing effort in the American government at this time. And then probably one of the most famous pieces of propaganda here, destroy this mad brute, enlist in the US Army. And we see here the Hun with the very German militaristic headpiece, coming onto American soil and seizing the Statue of Liberty. And so we want to make sure that this doesn't happen. So support the war in whatever way that you can. Now, unfortunately, with the support of this war came the suppression of another thing that Americans hold dear, and that is civil liberties. Civil liberties, bless you, which had very much so been a driving force in the progressive era, end up becoming a major target during the war. Some of the very zeal that drove the progressive movement turns in a zeal against speaking one's mind during the war era, because any individual who was viewed as pro-German or as being critical of American involvement in the war was viewed as being an enemy and somebody who could perhaps be a spy or soon a communist. And so Congress passes two laws, which are known as the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which collectively outlaw criticism of government leaders and war policies. The Espionage Act sets specific penalties for anybody who aided the enemy. And then the Sedition Act extended penalties to those who did or said anything to obstruct the sale of Liberty bonds. Some very famous Supreme Court cases during this time period are going to hinge upon these two acts. Ultimately, they are going to generate over 1,000 convictions, many of which are against socialists who were viewed as being anti-American by the establishment. In fact, our pal Eugene Debs once again is going to end up in jail during this time period. And in 1916, he is going to run for president from jail. Of course, he doesn't win, spoiler alert. We see the case of Schenck versus the United States, and Abrams versus the United States, which you'll see in your textbook, which basically say that in times of war, your First Amendment rights can be suspended if they are viewed as being against the nation's effort. Now, in subsequent Supreme Court cases like Tinker v. Des Moines, we've seen that go in the opposite direction, and some rights have been restored. But it's a very scary time in America. We are now involved in our first large-scale war, which by the time we actually put boots on the ground in May of 1918, this has escalated into a massive conflict. And there's also a lot of other changes going on in the world, which also make us increasingly fearful. One of which begins 6 months prior in November of 1917 in Russia. Russia began in the war, as we talked about, as an allied power on the side of Serbia. Unfortunately, as the Russians find themselves taking up Serbia's cause, their own government is beginning to fray at the fringes. And the Tsarist government of Tsar Nicholas II, here on the left, is struggling to maintain power and ultimately will be overthrown and in its place replaced by a government led by a gentleman here on the right by the name of Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin, of course, was a communist. He was a believer in Marxist theory. And Lenin believes that the Russians have no place being embroiled in a world conflict, that they need to focus on themselves and on his Russian comrades, the Russian people. And so they therefore pull out of the First World War, negotiating a treaty with Russia, or with Germany, known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, the concern for America and the other allied powers is that now that Russia is at peace with Germany and the Germans no longer have to worry about fighting them, they're worried that the Germans are going to move in and take Russian military supplies. And so we actually, as Americans, try to monitor the conditions in Russia from ports in Siberia. And all this ultimately ends up doing is backfiring on us. And the Russians begin to, and the communist government under Vladimir Lenin, begin to view the United States with suspicion. And of course, then our soon-to-be anti-communist activities are not going to endear us any further. And so it's really in World War I where the roots of the Cold War are born. And so a lot of the stuff that happens in World War I is ultimately going to cause problems for years beyond. So after 1918, American troops get increasingly involved. And as I mentioned, in May of 1918, we finally put boots on the ground. And throughout 1917, the Allies were largely on the defensive side of the war. The Germans were gaining ground, albeit slowly, in France. And now that they no longer have to worry about Soviet Russia, there are big concerns that the Allies could potentially lose the war. Fortunately, once Americans land on the ground in May of 1918, 1 million troops arrive in Europe. Their difference is felt almost immediately. In addition to the fact that the Americans helped the Triple Entente win a series of significant battles, they also boost morale in the Allied powers with their presence. And ultimately, by the summer of 1918, they are forcing the Germans back out of France. And that will ultimately lead to a declaration on November 11th of 1918 at 11 o'clock of a ceasefire and the end of World War I. So in the end, we find ourselves at this place, and that is at the Palace of Versailles in France. The ceasefire is declared in November of 1918, but the war doesn't officially draw to a close until June of 1919, when what is known as the Treaty of Versailles is signed in this palace in France. Going into the post-ceasefire period, the countries that are at war have to determine exactly what it is that they are fighting for. Unlike previous wars where the sides directly have stated what they hope to gain at the beginning of the war, as I mentioned, this war essentially evolves like a bar fight. And nobody really knows by the end what it is that they want or what it is that they are really fighting for, other than to simply beat the other side. There were no concrete territorial claims made at the outset of the war, nor were there concrete, I want this when I win type of declarations made. And so Woodrow Wilson is determined to steer this peace conference in Versailles. He feels that the United States, because they entered late in the war, has no selfish gains to be made from the war. We also don't have territory in this area, so it's not like we're seeking to gain territory to stack on top of what we already own. And so Wilson sees himself as kind of the individual who could have the ability to steer this peace conference. And so he goes into this peace conference with a plan that he calls, of course, the 14 points. His 14 points to create a program for peace and to cause World War I to ultimately have been the war to end all wars. The points are obviously numerous and also have several levels to them, but basically what Wilson is seeking to do is he is seeking to create an equal Europe, an equal Europe from the standpoint of territory, an equal Europe from the standpoint of mobilization, and an equal Europe from the standpoint of nationalism. To create a Europe composed of countries that are driven by what he calls self-determination, that ethnic groups will have the right to create their own borders and therefore hopefully find peace. Unfortunately for Wilson, France and England really don't want any parts of his plan for peace. They want revenge. And so the ultimate outcome of the treaty, as it is driven by the big four, as the United States, France, England, and Italy, who really isn't so big in this negotiation, is a peace treaty that leads to a lot of issues. And at the core of these issues is that the Treaty of Versailles ultimately places the blame on Germany. They say that it is the fault of the Germans that the war escalated to the level that it did, and that Germany must not only give up territory, but Germany must also pay reparations. That they must give money to those who they have harmed, to countries whose territory they have damaged, and to those countries who have suffered a loss of life. The amount of reparations is so large, it's to the tune of about $30 billion today, that it takes the Germans until 2011 to pay it off. Now, granted, they don't pay it during the time that Hitler's in power, but the amount of money, the $30 billion that they have to pay, is so large that it takes them until 2011 to pay it off. Now, I don't know about you, but if you just spent a lot of money fighting a battle and lost your own lives and have to restabilize your own country, and then you have to pay money on top of that, it's probably not going to make you feel too warm and fuzzy. And then to add insult to injury, we're going to take away some of your territory. We're going to give land to Poland. We're going to create a new country and call it Czechoslovakia. We're going to take land from you and your pal Austria-Hungary down here. And we're going to create this new territory. Oh, and yeah, we're going to split up your pal Austria-Hungary even more. He's just going to be Austria now. And we're going to create some additional countries out of his former empire. So it's just adding insult upon insult upon insult to the German people. The only real thing that Wilson gets out of the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations. And it was Wilson's plan for an international organization that would hopefully keep peace in the post-World War I era. Unfortunately for Wilson, the United States isn't able to join the to join the League of Nations, because when Wilson returns home in June of 1919 and hands the treaty over to the United States Senate, who's tasked with ratifying it, the senators, led by our nativist pal, Henry Cabot Lodge, won't ratify the treaty because they think it's going to involve the United States in future wars. by turning our power over to the League of Nations. And so it's going to prevent us from being the isolationists that these men want us to be by getting us involved in the League of Nations. So the very thing that Wilson is successfully able to get in whole into the treaty ends up being the very thing that prevents the United States from ratifying it. And Wilson is so distraught by this that he goes on a city by city train tour in an attempt to convince the people, the American people, that they need to lean on their senators to ratify the treaty. And it's during this whistle-stop train tour that he suffers a stroke that will really incapacitate him for the rest of his presidency and lead to his death shortly after his term ends in 1921. So it's a very sad end for Wilson. He is mildly successful in his attempts at self-determination, creating the country of Czechoslovakia. Today, people of the Czech Republic still hail him as a hero. But again, this is going to contribute in part as well to World War II, as we will see next week. In addition to the difficulties of Versailles, post-war life in America has other problems. Returning home, these soldiers, of course, are very happy to see their families, but many of them are also carrying the Spanish flu, which will quickly spread around the globe and kill twice as many people, as many individuals who died during World War II. We have 22 million people that die in 1918 as a result of exposure to the Spanish flu. We also have major issues with the economic transition during this time period, because the sudden cancellation of war contracts lead industries with a lack of orders for their goods, and thus lead to layoffs. And with that, you add into the fact that these soldiers are returning home and want to return to their jobs, which are in part no longer available because of the fact that these industries are downsizing. And also these men have been replaced in part by women who are in many cases eager to return home to their domestic realm, but African Americans who are not as willing to, because they've now migrated north for these jobs, which is going to lead to a rise in racial tension. The summer of 1919 is characterized by race riots throughout the United States, and for many years was known as the Red Summer because of the amount of blood that was spilled. We also have another red at this time, and that is, of course, the Red Scare. With the rise of communism in Russia and the end of our fixation on a world war, we now need a new menace in our society, and that, of course, will be communism. And so it's going to be something that is going to escalate throughout the 1920s and not only lead to issues within the political realm, but also lead to a lot of anti-immigrant feelings, coalescing in 1924 in what's known as the Johnson-Reed Act, which is going to severely restrict immigration from Eastern Europe, largely in part due to the fact that we're fearful these people might be tainted as communists. So in the end, the impact of World War I is vast. It continues to alter the position of women in society. Unfortunately, it's also going to further highlight the racial tensions in America. And it's going to reinforce our role in world affairs, but also breed our desire for isolationism. And ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles is going to contribute to issues overseas, including the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, which we'll explore next week. For this week, you are going to take a look at chapters 28 to 30 in your textbooks. There is a Socrative tonight, as usual, and it is, of course, the room code JGOS 825. Just to show you what your expectations are for this week, you're going to go under your assignments and take a look now at Unit 2. And we're in, of course, week 4. You're going to be looking at more specific effects of the Treaty of Versailles. You're going to be doing a video tour of the Roaring Twenties. And you're also going to be looking at the causes of the Great Depression. I forgot that president's activity I mentioned is something I do with my other class, so you guys don't have to worry about that. So those are your 3 assignments for this week. You should also have watched your film or be pretty well into reading your book that you're planning on reviewing, and should work to post your synopsis on Blackboard on the discussion board. You can access that assignment on this page under the Critical Analysis Quick Review. There are a few of you, I don't know if it's anybody here, but a couple of you still have not posted what book or film you're reviewing. If you are one of those people, please do that. You may have noticed a hit to your grade tonight, and that's because I don't know what topic you're doing. If you post that, your grade will get fixed. But make sure you post what topic it is you're doing so I can help guide you as we start to steer towards home in the critical analysis realm. So any questions on tonight? Anything we talked about? You guys get out a little early? I know you're all distraught.
How long did the first 4 last?
4 years. Our involvement was about 1.5 years, but it was ultimately a 4-year war. Any other questions? All right. So if you have any, you can